Some paths wait quietly for the one soul willing to remember them. Every morning at exactly 7:15, Daniel Carter followed the same gravel trail that curved along the edge of Black Pine Forest with Shadow trotting faithfully beside him. For nearly 4 years, the walk never changed. The same weathered wooden bridge crossed the narrow creek. The same towering pines whispered above them whenever the wind slipped through their branches. The same scent of damp earth, wild cedar, and fresh morning dew filled the cool Pennsylvania air. Daniel treasured the routine because routines were steady, and steady things had helped him rebuild a life after leaving the Marine Corps. Shadow had been beside him through sleepless nights, silent anniversaries, and mornings when getting out of bed felt like its own small victory. The German Shepherd had never once ignored a command, never wandered from the trail, and never behaved without purpose. That was why the change unsettled Daniel far more than he wanted to admit. It began with something so small that another person might have laughed and forgotten it before breakfast. Halfway through their walk, Shadow suddenly stopped. His ears lifted high. His body became perfectly still. His amber eyes fixed on a narrow opening hidden behind thick blackberry bushes where no maintained trail appeared on any local map. Daniel waited. Shadow did not move. Then, without barking or looking back, the dog stepped off the gravel path and disappeared into the overgrown brush. Daniel sighed as he pushed branches aside and followed him a few yards before calling softly, "Shadow, heel." The command had always worked. Always. This time, the German Shepherd did not even turn his head. He continued another 20 feet before stopping beside an ancient oak whose twisted roots disappeared beneath layers of fallen leaves. Shadow lowered his nose to the ground and slowly circled the tree. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he began scratching gently at the soil with quiet determination. Daniel frowned. There was no squirrel scent, no fresh tracks, no burrow, nothing his experienced eyes could recognize. "Come on, buddy," he muttered with a tired smile. "There is nothing here." Shadow ignored him again. The scratching continued. Slow, careful, almost deliberate. Daniel eventually clipped the leash onto Shadow's collar and guided him back toward the main trail. The dog resisted only for a second before following, but every few steps he glanced over his shoulder as though leaving something unfinished behind. The walk home felt strangely quiet. Even the birds seemed distant beneath the gray morning sky. Back at the farmhouse, Shadow skipped breakfast for the first time in years. Instead of settling beside the porch as he always did, he sat facing the forest beyond the fields. He remained there for nearly an hour without moving, his eyes locked on something Daniel could not see. By the next morning, it happened again. The same stop, the same hidden opening, the same oak tree, the same patient scratching beneath the leaves. On the third morning, Daniel stood with folded arms, watching his loyal companion repeat every movement exactly as before, almost as though someone invisible had drawn a map only the dog could follow. Concern slowly replaced confusion. Shadow was 7 years old now. Age changed everyone. Maybe something was wrong. Maybe his hearing had faded. Maybe memories inside his remarkable mind had become tangled. Daniel knelt beside him, gently resting a hand against the thick black and tan fur around his neck. Shadow finally looked up. There was no fear in those intelligent amber eyes. No panic. No sickness. Only quiet certainty. A certainty so deep that, for one impossible moment, Daniel felt as though the dog was trying to ask him for one final act of trust. The uneasy feeling followed Daniel long after that third morning ended. He tried convincing himself there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps a rabbit had built a nest beneath the old oak. Perhaps another animal had passed through the area often enough to leave a scent only Shadow could recognize. The forest held countless secrets that human senses could never detect. Still, none of those explanations felt right. Shadow had spent 7 years proving that every unusual action carried a reason. Daniel had trusted that instinct through snowstorms, hiking trips, and countless quiet mornings in the Pennsylvania wilderness. Trust did not disappear easily, even when confusion tried to replace it. The following afternoon, Daniel drove into the nearby town of Ash Creek to volunteer at the local food pantry, a routine he had kept since retiring from the Marine Corps. Shadow normally greeted every familiar face with calm enthusiasm before settling near the entrance where children often stopped to pet him. Today was different. The German Shepherd remained unusually quiet, lifting his head toward the distant tree line every few minutes as though listening for something carried on the wind. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, an elderly volunteer who had known Daniel for years, smiled gently as she watched Shadow. "He seems distracted today," she said while arranging canned vegetables onto a shelf. Daniel nodded with a tired smile. "He keeps leading me toward an old section of black pine forest. Every morning. Same place. Same tree." Evelyn glanced toward Shadow, who calmly watched the window overlooking the hills. "Dogs do not usually waste their energy," she replied thoughtfully. "Especially one like him." Daniel appreciated her kindness, but he could not ignore the growing concern in the back of his mind. That evening he brushed Shadow's thick black and tan coat on the farmhouse porch as the setting sun painted long golden shadows across the fields. Normally the grooming relaxed them both. Shadow would close his eyes while Daniel worked carefully through the dense fur, occasionally leaning into the brush with quiet satisfaction. Tonight the dog remained alert. His ears turned toward the distant forest every few moments, and his gaze repeatedly drifted beyond the fence line. Daniel gently rested one hand against Shadow's shoulder. "You are making me worry, partner," he whispered. Shadow responded by placing his head lightly against Daniel's knee for a brief moment before looking back toward the trees. The gesture carried reassurance instead of fear, almost as though the German Shepherd wanted Daniel to understand that nothing was wrong, only unfinished. Before sunrise the next morning, a cool mist settled across the valley, covering the fields in a pale silver blanket. Daniel clipped the leash onto Shadow's collar and started toward the familiar trail once again. The gravel crunched softly beneath their boots and paws while birds slowly welcomed the coming daylight from deep inside the pines. When they reached the hidden opening, Daniel did not call Shadow back this time. Instead, he quietly followed. Thick blackberry vines brushed against his jacket as they stepped beyond the overgrown entrance. The narrow path was almost invisible beneath years of fallen leaves, moss, and young saplings pushing through the forgotten ground. It did not resemble an animal trail. It looked like something that had once been used often before nature patiently reclaimed it. Shadow walked slowly, never rushing, occasionally lowering his nose before continuing another few yards with calm confidence. Daniel noticed something unusual almost immediately. Beneath the blanket of leaves, faint traces of old stone borders appeared along the edges of the narrow trail, as though someone had carefully marked its path decades earlier. A few minutes later, Shadow stopped beside the ancient oak once more. Instead of scratching immediately, he stood perfectly still, staring toward something half-hidden beneath tangled ivy several feet away. Daniel followed his gaze and stepped closer. Resting against a weathered tree root, almost completely buried beneath moss and damp leaves, lay the corner of a small, round metal object that had clearly not belonged to the forest. Daniel crouched beside the weathered tree root and carefully brushed away the damp leaves covering the small metal object. The earth was cool beneath his fingertips, carrying the rich scent of moss, pine needles, and rain that had soaked into the forest floor through countless seasons. Shadow stood only a few feet away without making a sound. His ears remained forward, his amber eyes following every movement Daniel made with quiet patience. Whatever had drawn the German Shepherd here each morning seemed connected to the object slowly emerging from the soil. Daniel gently lifted it free. It was not a coin as he had first imagined. It was an old, brass hiking medallion, no larger than the palm of his hand, attached to a faded strip of dark green fabric that had nearly dissolved with age. Years of weather had covered the surface with a soft layer of oxidation, but after rubbing it carefully against his sleeve, faint lettering slowly appeared beneath the dirt. Black Pine Junior Rangers. Summer Expedition. Daniel turned the medallion over. Scratched into the back, almost too lightly to notice, were two initials followed by the number 12. T.H. 12. He frowned thoughtfully. It looked personal rather than official. Someone had carried this for a reason. Shadow quietly stepped closer, lowered his nose toward the medallion, and inhaled once before lifting his head again. He did not paw at it or bark. Instead, he turned toward the forgotten trail and walked another 30 feet before stopping once more. Daniel slipped the medallion into his jacket pocket and followed. The path became slightly easier to recognize now that he knew what to look for. Beneath years of fallen leaves, flat stones occasionally surfaced in uneven rows, suggesting this had once been a maintained hiking trail. Young saplings now grew directly through sections of the old pathway, their thin trunks proving nobody had walked here in many years. The forest itself seemed strangely peaceful. Sunlight filtered through towering pine branches in long golden shafts, while tiny particles drifted silently in the cool morning air. A woodpecker tapped somewhere far above them, and a distant creek whispered beneath layers of smooth stone. Daniel found himself slowing his pace without realizing it. The place carried an unusual stillness, not unsettling, but deeply forgotten, as though nature had carefully folded it away from memory instead of destroying it. Shadow stopped beside a fallen cedar log whose bark had almost completely disappeared beneath emerald moss. Daniel noticed something caught beneath one edge of the decaying wood. Kneeling once again, he carefully moved several loose branches aside until the corner of an old wooden trail marker became visible. Most of the paint had vanished long ago, yet one carved arrow remained surprisingly clear. It pointed deeper into the forest, toward terrain that no longer appeared on any modern hiking map Daniel had ever used. The lower portion of the sign carried faded carved letters almost erased by time. He leaned closer until they finally became readable. Cedar Ridge Camp. 1 mile. Daniel quietly repeated the words under his breath. He had lived near Black Pine Forest for years and had never once heard anyone mention Cedar Ridge Camp. The name stirred no memory at all. Shadow waited beside the sign without impatience, occasionally glancing farther down the forgotten trail before looking back at Daniel again. It was the same expression he had worn every morning since this strange journey had begun. Calm, certain, trusting that Daniel would eventually choose to keep following. Daniel slowly stood, taking one last look at the weathered marker before turning his eyes toward the narrow path disappearing between the towering pines. Somewhere beyond those trees lay a place the forest had hidden for decades, and for reasons he still could not explain, his faithful companion seemed to know exactly where it was. Daniel remained standing beside the weathered trail marker for several quiet moments, letting the words settle into his thoughts. Cedar Ridge Camp. 1 mile. The name felt strangely familiar without belonging to any memory he could clearly place. He had studied local hiking maps for years, volunteered with search teams after retiring from the Marine Corps, and explored nearly every public trail winding through Black Pine Forest. Yet he had never once seen Cedar Ridge marked anywhere. Nature had almost erased every sign that people had ever walked this forgotten path. Shadow waited patiently several yards ahead, looking back only once before continuing at the same steady pace. There was no urgency in the German shepherd's movements. He was not chasing a scent drifting on the wind. He walked with the calm confidence of someone following directions already written deep inside his memory. Daniel slipped the old brass medallion from his jacket pocket and examined it once more while walking. The faded green ribbon had nearly fallen apart, but the engraved initials remained clear. T.H. 12. The letters meant nothing to him, yet they felt too deliberate to ignore. After nearly 20 minutes, the forgotten trail opened into a small clearing hidden beneath towering pine trees. Sunlight filtered softly through the branches, illuminating patches of moss and clusters of wild ferns growing across what had once been level ground. Stone fire rings barely visible beneath layers of leaves circled the clearing. Rotting wooden benches rested where they had collapsed decades earlier. Rusted hooks still clung to the trunk of an old oak, suggesting lanterns or signs had once hung there during happier summers. Shadow slowed to a stop near the center of the clearing. He lowered his nose to the ground, walked in a careful circle, then continued toward a weathered wooden post leaning at an angle beside a large granite boulder. Daniel brushed away vines covering the post until faded carved letters emerged from the gray wood. Cedar Ridge Youth Camp. Established 1978. Closed 2002. He quietly read the words aloud. A cool breeze stirred the pine branches overhead, carrying the faint scent of cedar and damp earth across the forgotten campsite. Everything around him suggested laughter. Campfires, songs, and children's voices had once filled this quiet place before time gently carried them away. Shadow moved beyond the clearing toward the edge of a narrow hillside where another overgrown footpath disappeared into thicker woods. Daniel followed until he noticed something unusual beneath a cluster of low mountain laurel bushes. Half buried under years of leaves rested a weathered wooden sign shaped like an arrow. Someone had painted bright blue stripes along its edges long ago, though only faded traces remained. One corner had broken away, yet a single word could still be read. Overlook. Shadow stood beside the sign without moving. Daniel glanced toward the hillside beyond it. Through gaps in the trees, he could see distant valleys stretching beneath the morning sky. Whatever lay ahead had once been important enough for campers to visit regularly. Before taking another step, Daniel reached for his phone and searched Archive County Trail. Maps. Nothing appeared. He searched local history websites. Still nothing. It was as though Cedar Ridge Camp had quietly disappeared from every modern record. Just as he slipped the phone back into his pocket, the distant sound of an approaching engine drifted through the trees. A green utility vehicle slowly emerged from another service road hidden beyond the clearing. An elderly forest ranger stepped out, removed his hat, and froze the moment his eyes settled on the weathered camp sign. His expression changed from curiosity to disbelief. He looked at Daniel, then at Shadow, before quietly asking the question that made the silent forest seem even older. Where did you find this place? We closed every trail leading here more than 20 years ago. The elderly forest ranger remained motionless beside his green utility vehicle, his weathered face revealing a mixture of surprise and disbelief that could not be hidden behind years of experience. He slowly removed his leather gloves before stepping into the clearing, his eyes never leaving the faded Cedar Ridge sign leaning against the granite boulder. Shadow watched him calmly, neither barking nor retreating, simply standing beside Daniel with the same quiet confidence that had guided them here every morning. Daniel introduced himself and explained how the German Shepherd had insisted on returning to the forgotten trail day after day until he finally chose to follow. The ranger listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing toward Shadow as though studying an old memory. After several moments, he extended his hand. "My name is Thomas Grayson," he said softly. "I worked this forest for 35 years before retiring. I have not stood in this clearing since the gates were closed." Daniel looked around the abandoned campsite once more. Why was it closed? Thomas lowered his eyes toward the moss-covered fire ring near the center of the clearing. Officially, declining attendance and budget cuts. That is what every report says. He paused before quietly adding, "But there was another reason most people eventually stopped talking about." A gentle breeze carried pine needles across the old stone path while sunlight filtered through the towering trees in long golden beams. The forest seemed to grow even quieter as Thomas slowly walked toward the weathered benches. During the final summer the camp was open, a 12-year-old boy named Tyler Hayes disappeared during an afternoon nature hike. Daniel immediately reached into his jacket and carefully removed the brass hiking medallion. Thomas stared at the engraved initials before taking a slow breath. T.H. That belonged to Tyler. He gently turned the medallion over in his hands, his thumb resting on the worn green ribbon. Every camper received one, but Tyler carried his everywhere. His father told him it represented courage. Daniel felt the weight of the small object change completely inside his thoughts. It was no longer simply an old keepsake buried beneath leaves. It belonged to someone whose story had never truly ended. Thomas continued walking toward the narrow hillside trail marked Overlook. Hundreds of volunteers searched these woods. Rangers, deputies, neighbors, search dogs, even helicopters. We found footprints, broken branches, and scattered supplies, but never enough to understand where Tyler had gone after leaving the main trail. He looked back toward Shadow, whose ears remained quietly forward. Eventually, the search ended. The camp closed the following year. Nature slowly reclaimed everything. Daniel glanced at Shadow. "He keeps bringing me here. Not just to the clearing. He always wants to continue farther." Thomas followed the German Shepherd's gaze toward the narrow path disappearing beyond the Overlook sign. His expression became thoughtful. That trail was never part of the official search. Daniel frowned. "Why not?" Thomas smiled sadly. "Because a landslide blocked the upper section shortly after Tyler disappeared. Everyone believed nobody could have crossed it safely, so resources were focused elsewhere." Shadow suddenly began walking again. He did not rush or pull ahead. He simply followed the forgotten trail beyond the Overlook marker, pausing every few yards to make sure Daniel was still behind him. Thomas watched the German shepherd disappear between the towering pines before, quietly shaking his head. I spent decades believing this forest had already shared every secret it was willing to give, he whispered. Then he looked directly at Daniel with calm seriousness. If that remarkable dog still believes there is something farther ahead after all these years, I think we owe him enough trust to keep following. Shadow moved steadily along the forgotten hillside trail, placing each paw with quiet confidence, as though the forest itself had whispered directions only he could understand. Daniel walked only a few feet behind him, while Thomas Grayson followed more slowly, occasionally stopping to study landmarks he had not seen in more than 20 years. The trail narrowed until thick ferns brushed against their legs and low pine branches filtered the afternoon sunlight into soft golden ribbons. The air grew noticeably cooler beneath the dense canopy. Every breath carried the scent of damp cedar, moss-covered stone, and earth that had remained untouched through countless seasons. No voices disturbed the silence. Only distant birdsong and the gentle rustling of leaves accompanied their careful footsteps. After nearly half a mile, the terrain began to rise. Large granite outcroppings appeared between the trees, their surfaces covered with emerald moss and pale gray lichen. Daniel noticed something unusual along the edge of the trail. Beneath layers of fallen needles, several flat stones formed a rough line that seemed too orderly to have occurred naturally. Thomas knelt beside one of them and gently brushed away years of forest debris. This was part of the original hiking route, he said quietly. Camp counselors stacked these stones to help children stay on the path during foggy mornings. Daniel looked farther ahead. More stones emerged one after another, almost invisible beneath nature's patient work. Shadow paused beside each marker only briefly before continuing, never hesitating, never choosing another direction. It was as though he already knew exactly which path still mattered. Eventually, the trees opened onto a small overlook where the valley stretched for miles beneath a brilliant blue sky. Daniel stepped forward and immediately understood why campers had once gathered there. Rolling forests reached toward distant mountains while a narrow river shimmered like silver beneath the afternoon sun. The peaceful view made it difficult to imagine that this place had ever been connected to sadness. Shadow, however, ignored the scenery completely. Instead, he turned away from the overlook and approached the base of an enormous white oak growing near the cliff's edge. The tree was unlike any other in the area. Its trunk measured nearly 6 feet across, and deep roots twisted over massive boulders before disappearing into the hillside. Shadow lowered his nose and quietly circled the tree once. Then he stopped beside one exposed root and gently scraped away leaves with slow, deliberate movements. Daniel immediately knelt beside him. This time the soil was softer than before, disturbed not recently but differently, as though years of rain had gradually uncovered something hidden beneath the surface. Together they carefully moved aside loose earth and layers of damp leaves. A few moments later Daniel's fingers touched weathered metal. He pulled gently until a small rectangular tin box emerged from beneath the root. Rust covered nearly every corner, yet the lid remained tightly sealed. Thomas inhaled sharply the instant he saw it. "Camp emergency supply boxes," he whispered. Each hiking group carried one. Daniel carefully brushed away dirt before lifting the lid. Inside, wrapped inside brittle waxed cloth that had somehow protected it from moisture, rested a folded paper map, a small brass compass, and a leather notebook no larger than his hand. Everything inside appeared remarkably well preserved despite the passing years. Daniel slowly opened the notebook. The first page contained only a name written neatly in blue ink. Tyler Hayes. Beneath it, another sentence had been added in careful handwriting that seemed almost impossible after so much time. "If someone ever finds this, please tell my family I never stopped trying to follow the trail home." The forest fell completely silent around them. Daniel looked toward Shadow, whose calm amber eyes remained fixed not on the notebook, but farther beyond. The great white oak, as though even this remarkable discovery was only one more step toward a truth that had not yet fully revealed itself. Daniel held the small leather notebook with both hands, as though it were something fragile enough to disappear if handled carelessly. The pages had yellowed with time, but the waxed cloth inside the metal box had protected them from moisture far better than anyone could have imagined. A faint scent of aged paper and cedar drifted upward as he carefully opened the cover. Thomas Grayson stepped beside him without speaking. Shadow remained quietly near the great white oak, his ears relaxed, his gaze drifting occasionally toward the deeper forest beyond the overlook. Daniel slowly turned the first page. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to a 12-year-old boy. Neat, careful, and hopeful. The opening entries described ordinary camp adventures. Tyler wrote about learning to read a compass, roasting marshmallows over a campfire, catching his first trout, and waking before sunrise to watch deer walk through the mist. Daniel smiled softly. Every sentence sounded like the voice of a child discovering a world larger than himself. The following pages changed gradually. Tyler described becoming fascinated by old trails that counselors no longer used. One afternoon, he noticed faded stone markers leading beyond the official hiking route. He asked about them several times, but every adult simply smiled and told him those paths had been abandoned years earlier. Instead of losing interest, Tyler became even more curious. He wrote that forgotten places deserved to be remembered because someone had once built them with purpose. Thomas quietly lowered his eyes. "That sounds exactly like him," he whispered. Daniel continued reading. The final dated entry described the afternoon Tyler left the main hiking group for only a few minutes after spotting another weathered trail marker hidden beneath vines. He believed he could quickly follow it to the overlook before returning to camp. Instead, thick fog rolled unexpectedly across the ridge. Tyler admitted he became confused after several familiar landmarks disappeared behind the mist. His compass remained inside the emergency tin because he had believed he would not need it for such a short walk. Daniel paused for a long moment before carefully turning to the final page. There was no fear in Tyler's last message. No anger. No blame. Only remarkable honesty. The boy explained that after realizing he could not immediately retrace his steps, he chose to remain near the great white oak because counselors had taught campers that staying in one safe location gave rescuers the best chance of finding them. He carefully placed the notebook, the map, and the compass inside the emergency box beneath the tree roots to protect them from rain. His final handwritten lines were simple enough to make the silent forest feel even quieter. "Dad always says trails work both ways. If I stay here, somebody will eventually follow this one back to me. If they cannot find me today, maybe they will someday. Please tell Mom I was never afraid because I believed someone would keep looking." Daniel slowly closed the notebook, unable to speak for several seconds. Thomas removed his hat and held it quietly against his chest while looking toward the valley below. Shadow calmly walked back to Daniel and gently rested his head beneath Daniel's hand without taking his eyes off the forest beyond the white oak. It was only then that Daniel noticed something else. Just beyond the roots, nearly hidden beneath layers of moss, another narrow path continued downhill through the trees. Unlike every trail they had followed so far, this one was marked by a series of small stone cairns stretching into the distance. Thomas stared at them with growing disbelief. "Those were never here," he said quietly. "Or perhaps they were. We simply never searched far enough to see them." Shadow took several calm steps toward the first stone marker before stopping once again and looking back, as though gently reminding them that Tyler's story had finally been found, but the forgotten trail itself had not yet shared its final answer. Daniel looked from the weathered notebook to the line of carefully stacked stone cairns disappearing into the trees. None of them spoke for several seconds. The silence carried a strange kind of respect, as though the forest itself had been waiting years for someone to listen instead of simply searching. Shadow stood beside the first stone marker without moving. His tail rested naturally behind him, his ears relaxed, his steady amber eyes fixed on the narrow path ahead. There was no excitement in him, no urgency, only the same calm certainty that had brought Daniel here one careful step at a time. Thomas slowly exhaled. If Tyler built these markers himself, he was trying to leave directions. Daniel nodded. Not just for rescuers. Maybe for anyone who came after him. They followed the line of cairns downhill through towering pines where shafts of afternoon sunlight reached the forest floor in narrow columns of gold. Moss covered fallen logs, wild ferns brushed against their boots, and the distant sound of running water gradually grew stronger with every step. The trail remained almost invisible except for the small stone markers, each one placed just far enough from the last to remain visible without breaking the natural beauty of the landscape. Whoever built them had been patient, careful, and determined. After nearly 15 minutes, Shadow stopped beside a shallow creek flowing quietly between smooth granite rocks. The water was crystal clear, reflecting patches of blue sky through the canopy above. Daniel noticed another cairn resting beside a flat stone at the water's edge. He stepped closer and found something tucked carefully beneath it. It was a small folded sheet of waterproof map paper, protected inside a clear plastic sleeve that had yellowed with age but remained intact. Daniel unfolded it slowly. Tyler had drawn a simple hand-sketched map of the forgotten trails surrounding Cedar Ridge Camp. A small handwritten note filled one corner of the page. The bridge washed away after the storm. I found another way across the creek. If anyone comes looking, follow the stone markers. They stay above the water when it rains. Thomas stared quietly at the map before shaking his head in amazement. The search teams never crossed here because every official map showed the bridge farther upstream. When the bridge collapsed, everyone assumed this section was impossible to reach. Daniel looked across the creek. A series of broad stepping stones stretched naturally through the shallow water, nearly hidden beneath moss and flowing currents. They formed a safe crossing that would have been almost impossible to notice without Tyler's carefully placed cairns. Shadow stepped across them one by one with effortless confidence before stopping on the opposite bank to wait. Daniel and Thomas followed carefully, the cool water flowing gently around the stones beneath their boots. Beyond the creek, the forest changed again. Sunlight filtered through younger trees growing where an old landslide had once cleared the hillside decades earlier. Nature had quietly healed the landscape, hiding every sign that the earth had ever shifted. Thomas looked around with growing realization. This entire section looked completely different during the search. We never imagined the trail continued beyond the slide. Daniel folded Tyler's map with great care before placing it safely beside the notebook inside his jacket. He finally understood why Shadow had never abandoned the forgotten path. The German Shepherd had not been chasing a memory. He had been following a story that still wanted to be finished. Shadow slowly continued uphill once more, stopping briefly beneath another towering pine where one final stone cairn stood larger than all the others. Resting carefully on its flat top lay a small polished river stone. Someone had written 3 simple words across its smooth surface in faded blue ink that had somehow survived the passing years. Keep following home. The polished river stone rested quietly on top of the final cairn, its faded blue words almost disappearing beneath years of sun and rain, yet still carrying the simple promise Tyler had hoped someone would someday read. Daniel carefully lifted the stone into his hand, running his thumb across the weathered letters before placing it gently inside his jacket beside the notebook and map. Shadow remained standing near the cairn, calmly watching the narrow hillside beyond it. There were no more markers, no hidden paths, only untouched forest stretching toward the distant valley beneath the late afternoon sky. Thomas slowly removed his hat once again. I think this is where Tyler wanted someone to know he never stopped trying, he whispered. Daniel quietly nodded. He kept leaving hope instead of fear. The words lingered between them as the cool mountain breeze carried the scent of pine and cedar through the trees. After carefully photographing the notebook, the map, the brass medallion, and every stone marker they had discovered, Thomas contacted the county sheriff's office and the local historical records department. By sunset, several investigators, park officials, and preservation specialists arrived at Cedar Ridge Camp. They examined every discovery with extraordinary care, documenting each detail exactly where it had been found. Daniel remained nearby with Shadow, answering questions whenever needed, but mostly watching his faithful companion rest peacefully beneath the great white oak. For the first time since this strange journey had begun, Shadow appeared completely relaxed. He no longer stared into the deeper forest. Instead, he quietly watched the people gathering around Tyler's carefully protected belongings, almost as though he understood that the story no longer depended only on him. During the following week, county archivists compared Tyler's notebook with decades-old search records, camp maps, ranger reports, and family photographs. Every page matched details investigators had never been able to explain. The forgotten stone trail, The hidden creek crossing and the abandoned overlook route had simply vanished from official maps after storms, and changing landscapes slowly erased them from memory. Tyler had never wandered recklessly into danger, as many people had quietly assumed over the years. He had followed an older trail with the innocent curiosity of a child who loved exploring nature and believed every marked path would eventually lead safely home. When the landslide changed the landscape and heavy fog settled across the ridge, he had done exactly what he had been taught. He stayed near shelter, protected his supplies, carefully marked his route, and left clear directions for anyone who might eventually come looking. Thomas visited Daniel one quiet evening carrying a neatly folded newspaper. The front page showed only a photograph of the restored brass medallion resting beside Tyler's notebook beneath the headline, "Forgotten Camp Mystery Finally Explained After 22 Years." Thomas sat silently on the farmhouse porch while shadow rested between them. "I called Tyler's parents yesterday," he said softly. Daniel looked toward the distant fields glowing beneath the setting sun. "How did they take the news?" Thomas smiled with gentle sadness. "His father cried before I finished reading the first page of the notebook. Then he thanked every person who never completely gave up, even after all these years." Daniel lowered his hand onto Shadow's broad shoulder. The German shepherd closed his eyes for a brief moment, breathing slowly as the evening breeze moved gently through his thick blackened tan coat. Daniel finally understood what had drawn Shadow back to the forgotten trail every single morning. It had never been about finding something for himself. It had been about making certain that a 12-year-old boy's quiet promise would finally complete the journey home that time had left unfinished. The following Saturday, the small town gathered beneath a bright autumn sky at the entrance to Black Pine Forest. What had once been an abandoned trail hidden behind blackberry bushes was now carefully cleared, though its natural beauty remained untouched. Volunteers had removed only enough brush to make the old path safe again, leaving the towering pines, moss-covered stones, and quiet creek exactly as they had been. Daniel arrived early with Shadow walking calmly at his side. The German shepherd wore the same simple leather collar he had always worn, showing no awareness that nearly every person in town had come hoping to see the remarkable dog who refused to abandon a forgotten trail. Thomas Grayson stood near the restored trail marker, greeting families, retired rangers, and former Cedar Ridge campers who had traveled from neighboring counties after hearing the extraordinary story. Some carried faded photographs taken at summer camp decades earlier. Others quietly held old camp patches, journals, or wooden walking sticks they had kept through the years. Tyler Hayes' parents arrived just before the ceremony began. Time had turned their hair gray, but the gentle kindness in their faces remained unchanged. Daniel recognized them immediately from an old family photograph included inside Tyler's notebook. Neither of them hurried toward the gathering. They simply paused at the beginning of the trail and looked into the forest where their son had once walked with excitement and curiosity. Mrs. Hayes held Daniel's hands with both of hers before quietly saying, "For 22 years we wondered whether he had been frightened during his final day. Now we know he spent his last hours believing someone would eventually find his words. That changes everything." Daniel could find no reply worthy of the moment. He simply nodded while Shadow stepped forward and gently rested his head against Mr. Hayes' hand. The older man smiled through quiet tears as he slowly stroked the German shepherd's thick black and tan fur. "Thank you," he whispered softly. "I do not know why you kept returning here, but I am grateful you never stopped." The ceremony itself remained beautifully simple. There were no dramatic speeches or grand announcements. Thomas shared the history of Cedar Ridge Camp and explained how nature had slowly hidden the forgotten trail after storms reshaped the landscape. A county historian displayed Tyler's carefully preserved notebook, brass medallion, hand-drawn map, and polished river stone inside protective glass so future generations could understand the quiet courage carried by a 12-year-old boy. Finally, Tyler's father unfolded the last page of the notebook and read his son's closing message aloud. The entire gathering stood in complete silence as the familiar words drifted gently beneath the tall pines. No applause followed, only the soft sound of wind moving through cedar branches. Afterward, a small wooden sign was placed beside the restored trail. It did not describe a tragedy. Instead, it simply read, "Tyler Hayes Memorial Path. May every traveler remember that hope leaves footprints even when time tries to erase them. Shadow walked to the sign, paused for a single quiet moment, and looked toward the winding trail beyond it. Daniel watched carefully, expecting the familiar determination that had filled every morning for weeks. Instead, the German shepherd slowly turned away from the forest and walked back toward him with peaceful confidence. Daniel smiled as he rested one hand against Shadow's shoulder. For the first time since this remarkable journey had begun, the silent request in those loyal amber eyes had completely disappeared. The forgotten trail no longer carried an unfinished promise. It had finally become exactly what Tyler had hoped it would someday be, a path that led people home. Several weeks passed, and autumn slowly gave way to the quiet stillness of early winter. Frost appeared along the split-rail fences each morning, and thin sheets of ice formed across the edges of the creek that had once hidden Tyler's carefully marked crossing. Life in Ash Creek returned to its familiar rhythm. Children caught school buses before sunrise. Farmers prepared their equipment for the colder months. Store owners decorated windows with warm lights that reflected across the sidewalks during the early evenings. Yet beneath the ordinary routines, something gentle had changed. The restored memorial trail had quietly become part of the community instead of merely another historical landmark. Families walked it together on weekends. Teachers brought students to learn not only about local history, but about perseverance, hope, and the importance of paying attention to the smallest details. Daniel and Shadow continued their morning walks every day, although the route felt completely different now. They still crossed the old wooden bridge. They still listened to the wind moving through the towering pines. They still smelled damp cedar and fresh earth after every rainfall. The only difference was that when they reached the narrow opening behind the blackberry bushes, Shadow no longer stopped. He glanced toward the restored trail with calm acknowledgement before continuing beside Daniel without hesitation. It was such a simple change that most people would never have noticed it, but Daniel understood immediately. Whatever quiet responsibility had rested inside the German shepherd's faithful heart had finally been lifted. One crisp Saturday morning, Daniel volunteered once again at the local food pantry. Shadow lay peacefully near the entrance, greeting visitors with the same gentle patience that had always made children smile. A young boy no older than 8 cautiously approached, carrying a library book about famous search dogs. He knelt beside Shadow, carefully stroking the thick black and tan fur before looking up at Daniel with wide, curious eyes. Did he really remember the trail all by himself? The boy asked. Daniel smiled thoughtfully before answering. I do not know exactly what he remembered. He rested his hand on Shadow's shoulder. But I know he never stopped believing the trail still mattered. The boy nodded slowly, as though considering something much larger than the question he had asked. Before leaving, he gently hugged Shadow around the neck and whispered, "Thank you for helping someone get home." Shadow simply wagged his tail once before watching the child disappear through the doorway with his parents. That evening, Daniel sat on the farmhouse porch wrapped in a heavy wool blanket while snowflakes drifted lazily across the open fields. Shadow rested beside him with quiet contentment, occasionally lifting his head whenever distant owls called from the forest beyond the hills. Daniel looked toward Black Pine Forest, now softened beneath the pale winter sky. For weeks he had tried to understand why Shadow alone had insisted on returning to the forgotten trail when countless people had walked nearby, without noticing anything unusual. Eventually he accepted that some answers did not require complete explanation. During his years in the Marine Corps, he had learned to trust experienced teammates even when he could not immediately see what they saw. Life with Shadow had quietly taught him the same lesson all over again. Trust sometimes begins long before understanding arrives. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and removed the polished river stone Tyler had left behind. With permission from the Hayes family, he had been allowed to keep it until the permanent memorial display was completed. The faded blue words remained visible beneath the porch light. "Keep following home." Daniel smiled softly before placing the stone back into his pocket. Beside him, Shadow closed his eyes and rested peacefully against his leg, no longer listening for forgotten paths, because at last there were none left waiting to be found. Spring returned quietly to Black Pine Forest, washing away the last traces of winter and covering the hills with fresh green leaves, wildflowers, and the soft scent of new life. Morning sunlight filtered gently through the towering pines, illuminating the restored memorial trail that had once disappeared beneath years of forgotten undergrowth. Visitors now arrived from neighboring towns carrying cameras, hiking boots, and quiet curiosity, yet something remarkable happened each time they reached the entrance. Their voices naturally became softer. Children instinctively lowered their excitement to respectful whispers. Even strangers who had never heard Tyler Hayes' story somehow sensed they had stepped into a place where kindness had patiently outlived time itself. Daniel continued volunteering with the local historical society whenever weekends allowed, helping maintain the trail without changing its natural character. Fallen branches were cleared only when necessary. Moss-covered stones remained exactly where Tyler had once relied upon them. The great white oak still stretched its enormous branches above the hillside, sheltering the place where the weathered emergency tin had rested beneath its roots for more than 2 decades. Shadow accompanied Daniel during every visit, although his role had quietly changed. He no longer searched ahead or paused beside hidden landmarks. Instead, he walked beside families, greeted children with gentle patience, and calmly accepted every grateful hand that reached to stroke his thick black and tan fur. One sunny afternoon, Daniel noticed Tyler's parents standing beneath the great white oak once again. They had returned alone, carrying a small wooden birdhouse crafted by Tyler's father during the previous winter. Without ceremony, they carefully attached it to a nearby maple tree overlooking the memorial path. Mrs. Hayes smiled softly as a pair of bluebirds circled above before settling onto a nearby branch. "Tyler always wanted birds to have safe places to come home," she whispered. Daniel stood quietly beside them, saying nothing because no words seemed necessary. Shadow slowly approached the birdhouse, lifted his nose toward it for a brief moment, then settled comfortably beneath the tree, watching sunlight dance across the forest floor. The simple scene carried more healing than any speech ever could. As weeks passed, local schools began organizing nature walks along the restored trail. Teachers encouraged students to study trees, wildlife, and old stone markers while sharing Tyler's story as an example of courage, hope, and thoughtful preparation in the outdoors. The children listened carefully, but Daniel noticed they were often most fascinated by Shadow. They asked how a dog could remember a forgotten place after so many years. Daniel always answered the same way. "I cannot explain exactly how he knew. I only know he gave me one more reason to keep believing that loyalty sometimes sees what our eyes cannot." One afternoon, a little girl quietly placed a hand-painted stone beside the first cairn. Across its smooth surface, she had written only 3 words. "Someone remembered me." Daniel smiled when he noticed it because the message somehow belonged not only to Tyler, but to everyone who had ever feared being forgotten. As the sun slowly lowered behind the western hills, Daniel and Shadow began the familiar walk back toward the farmhouse. The gentle breeze carried birdsong through the trees while the restored trail disappeared peacefully behind them beneath the golden light of early evening. Daniel looked down at his faithful companion and realized that some journeys never truly end. They simply become quiet gifts passed from one heart to another, reminding every traveler who follows that the smallest act of faithfulness can continue echoing long after the footsteps themselves have faded from the trail. Summer arrived once again in Black Pine Forest, bringing warm sunlight that filtered through the tall pines exactly as it had countless seasons before. The restored memorial path blended so naturally into the landscape that first-time visitors often believed it had never disappeared at all. Wildflowers lined the edges of the old trail, bluebirds nested inside the little wooden birdhouse Tyler's father had built, and the great white oak continued standing watch above the hillside with quiet strength that seemed untouched by time. Daniel Carter and Shadow still walked the forest every morning at 7:15. Their routine had returned to the peaceful rhythm they once believed had been lost forever. They crossed the weathered wooden bridge, listened to the creek flowing over smooth stones, breathed the familiar scent of cedar and fresh earth, and watched the morning sunlight slowly awaken the valley below. When they reached the narrow entrance hidden behind the blackberry bushes, Shadow briefly turned his head toward the memorial trail. His amber eyes rested there for only a single heartbeat before he calmly continued forward beside Daniel without slowing his pace. Daniel smiled every single time. He no longer wondered whether Shadow would leave the trail again. He knew the answer. Some journeys ask us to search. Others simply ask us to remember. One quiet morning near the end of June, Daniel noticed a family standing beside the wooden memorial sign before beginning their hike. A little boy held his grandfather's hand while carefully reading every word carved into the weathered cedar. When they finished, the child looked up and asked, "Did somebody really keep looking all those years?" The older man smiled gently before pointing toward Daniel and Shadow walking together beneath the pines. Sometimes hope survives because one faithful friend refuses to quit. Daniel heard the words carried softly through the morning breeze, but he kept walking. The story no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to every person who believed forgotten promises still mattered. As they reached the crest overlooking the valley, Daniel stopped for a moment beside the great white oak. He rested one hand against its deeply rooted trunk while Shadow settled quietly at his side. Birds sang from the upper branches, sunlight shimmered across the distant river, and somewhere below, children laughed as they followed the same restored trail Tyler had once believed would someday lead someone back to him. Daniel looked down at Shadow and gently scratched behind the familiar black and tan ears. "You never lost your way," he whispered with a quiet smile. "I was the one who needed to catch up." Shadow looked back with the same calm expression that had carried them through every unanswered question from the very beginning. There was no triumph in those loyal eyes. No pride. Only peaceful contentment. Daniel finally understood why. Loyalty never asks for recognition. It simply continues walking until the work is done. As they started back toward the farmhouse, a gentle breeze moved through the forest, carrying the soft rustle of pine branches above the forgotten trail that was forgotten no longer. The stone cairns remained standing. The birdhouse welcomed new life each spring. Tyler's notebook rested safely where future generations could read his hopeful words. And every morning, one veteran and one faithful German shepherd continued walking side by side beneath the same Pennsylvania sky, leaving quiet footprints along a path that had become more than a trail. It had become living proof that even when time buries the truth beneath years of silence, love, loyalty, and one unwavering heart can still lead it home.